Some of us are tops, some of us are bottoms, and some of us we're switches, which means we love both the thrill of giving and the surrender of receiving, the power of directing, the power of directing, and the release of being directed. But here's the catch switching isn't just about flipping positions mid scene like you're changing channels. It comes with unique consent challenges, especially for trauma survivors and neurodivergent nervous systems. Because when roles are fluid, boundaries can get blurry. When power shifts back and forth, it's easy for assumptions to creep in. When your nervous system has to toggle between states of control and surrender, things can get dysregulating fast if you're not intentional about the transitions. So, how do you navigate role shifts without confusion, pressure, or accidental boundary crossings? How do you honor the complexity of wanting both without making your partners or yourself feel destabilized? Hey there, I'm Dr. Misty with Untamed Ember, and today we're diving into switching roles, staying safe, and how to make consent feel rock solid even when the roles are fluid. If you identify as a switch, if you've ever felt pressure to pick a side, if you've experienced confusion around boundaries when roles shift, or if you're just curious about what it means to navigate power dynamics with fluidity, this episode is for you because switches occupy this really interesting space in kink culture. We get told we're indecisive, greedy, or not serious enough about our roles. We get partners who assume that because we switch, we're always up for anything. We get our own nervous systems confused when we try to flip states too quickly without proper transition time. But here's what I know switching isn't confusion, it's range, it's complexity. It's the recognition that desire isn't one dimensional and neither is power. So let's talk about how to honor that range while keeping everyone, yourself included, safe, boundaried, and consensually engaged. Let's get into it. So let's start with the basics. What does it actually mean to be a switch? In kink and sex culture, a switch is someone who enjoys multiple roles. You might switch between dominant and submissive, between top and bottom, between caregiver and little, between the person giving sensation and the person receiving it. The specific roles vary depending on what kind of play you're into, but the core principle is the same. You don't have a fixed position. You're not always the one in control, and you're not always the one surrendering. You move between these states depending on your mood, your partner, the scene, or just what feels right in the moment. And here's what needs to be said right up front switches are not indecisive. We're not greedy. We're not commitment phobic about our kink identities. We're versatile. We contain multitudes. We've just recognized that our desire doesn't fit neatly into a single box. There's this weird cultural assumption, both in kink communities and in broader sexual culture, that you're supposed to have one role and stick to it. That being a real dominant means you never want to submit. That being a true submissive means you never want control. But that's bullshit. Desire is complex. Identity is complex. And for many of us, the appeal of power dynamics isn't about always being on one side. It's about the full spectrum of what power exchange can offer. So, why is switching appealing? What draws people to role fluidity? For many neurodivergent folks, switching offers sensory and emotional variety that helps with regulation. Sometimes your nervous system craves the focused, directive energy of topping, the clarity of being in control, making decisions, orchestrating sensation. Other times, it craves the soft, receptive energy of bottoming, the release of responsibility, the permission to just feel without having to think. Both states can be regulating depending on what your nervous system needs in that moment. Switching gives you access to both tools. For trauma survivors, switching can be powerful because it allows you to reclaim agency in multiple ways. Maybe you're reclaiming your right to surrender by choosing to bottom in a safe container. And maybe you're reclaiming your power by topping and directing a scene on your terms. You don't have to choose one narrative of healing. You get to hold both. For people who are naturally fluid in other aspects of identity, like gender, sexuality, or relationship structure, switching often feels congruent. If you're someone who doesn't experience identity as fixed in other areas, why would your sexual or kink role be any different? And for some people, switching is just fun. It's about novelty, creativity, and balance. It's about not getting bored. It's about experiencing intimacy from multiple angles and discovering what each role teaches you about yourself and about your partners. Here's my favorite comparison. Switches are like bisexuals of the kink world. People assume you can't pick a side, that you're confused or you're going through a phase. But really, you're just doubling your fun. You're refusing to limit your desire to someone else's categories. And just like bisexuality, switching comes with its own specific challenges around visibility, validation, and consent. Because when your identity doesn't fit neatly into the binary roles people expect, you have to work harder to make yourself understood and to protect your boundaries. So, what makes consent more complicated for switches? Let me be clear. Consent is always essential, regardless of your role or your identity. But switching introduces some specific challenges that don't exist when roles are fixed. First, role shifts can confuse boundaries if they're not explicitly negotiated. When you're switching, especially mid scene, there's a question that needs answering. Who's in charge when the power flips? If you started the scene with person A as the dominant and person B as the submissive, and then you switch, does that mean all the boundaries get reversed too? Does person B now have the same authority as person A had? Are the agreed upon limits the same in both directions? You can't assume, you have to negotiate. Because here's what happens when you don't. One person thinks switching is implied, that the negotiation covered both roles. The other person thought that they were only agreeing to one specific dynamic. And suddenly, you've got a consent mismatch that neither person intended. Second, there's a risk of consent blurring when assumptions fill the gaps. Some people assume that if someone identifies as a switch, they're automatically up for both roles all the time. That's not true. Just because someone enjoys both topping and bottoming doesn't mean they want to do both in every encounter with every partner or even at all with certain people. Your switch identity is not a standing invitation. Each scene, each role, each dynamic requires its own explicit consent. And here's where it gets tricky. Sometimes partners who know you're a switch might pressure you to switch when you're not feeling it. Come on, I know you like topping too. Why don't you want to switch tonight? That pressure, even if it's not aggressive, even if it's coming from a place of enthusiasm, is a consent issue. Your desire to switch needs to be coming from you, not from someone else's expectation that you should want both roles equally all the time. Third, nervous system perspective. Switching states can be genuinely dysregulating. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Topping and bottoming require different nervous system states, and rapidly switching between them can be jarring if your body isn't prepared. Topping typically requires sympathetic activation, that focused, directive, slightly aroused energy. You're paying attention, making decisions, orchestrating the scene, and your nervous system is online and engaged in a specific way. Bottoming often requires ventral vagal surrender, that soft, receptive, trusting state where you can let go of control and just receive. Your nervous system is still engaged, but in a completely different way. These are not the same state, and asking your nervous system to flip between them without transition time is like asking someone to go from sprinting to meditating with no cooldown period. It's possible, but it's not easy. For some people, it's genuinely overwhelming. For neurodivergent folks especially, state shifts can be extra challenging. If you struggle with transitions in general, moving from one activity to another, shifting emotional gears, adapting to changes in routine, then switching roles mid-scene might require more support and structure than you initially expected. Let me give you an example of how this plays out. I worked with a couple, let's call them Nat and Kellen, who both identified as switches. They were excited to explore switching mid-scene and had negotiated that they'd start with Nat topping and then switch roles halfway through. But when the moment came to switch, Kellen froze. Not because they didn't want to top, they absolutely did, but because their nervous system wasn't ready for the gear change. They'd been in this soft, receptive, almost floaty state, and then suddenly they were being asked to shift into focused, directive energy. Their brain couldn't make the jump that fast. Nat interpreted the freeze as hesitation or discomfort and immediately stopped everything. which made Kellen feel guilty and broken. They thought they should be able to switch seamlessly because they identified as a switch. But here's the thing: identifying as a switch doesn't mean your nervous system can flip states on command. It just means you have access to multiple roles when the conditions are right. What Nat and Kellen needed, and what they eventually built into their play, was transition time, a pause between roles, a chance for Kellen's nervous system to come up from that receptive state, reorient, and shift into the energy needed for topping. Once they built in that buffer, switching became accessible and enjoyable. But without it, they were asking Kellen's body to do something it simply wasn't equipped to do in that moment. This is the consent complication that switches face. It's not just about whether you want both roles. It's about whether your nervous system can actually access both roles in the time frame and the context that you're working with. So, how do you navigate switching in a way that honors both your desire for role fluidity and your need for clear boundaried consent? Here's the framework: negotiate before you play and be specific. Don't just say, "We're going to switch tonight," and then assume that you're on the same page about what that means. Get detailed. Here's an example: we're starting with you topping me. You'll be doing impact play, specifically spanking and flogging. After about 20 minutes, if we're both still feeling it, we'll pause, check in, and potentially switch roles. When we switch, I'll take over as top and you'll be receiving. The activities that we've agreed on for my topping are X, Y, and Z. Does that all sound good? Notice how specific that is? There's no ambiguity about timing, activities, or what switching actually entails. And here's what's crucial: build in an explicit check-in moment before the switch happens. Don't just assume that because you negotiated switching beforehand, both people are still up for it in the moment. Try this. Okay, we're at the point where we talked about potentially switching. How are you feeling? Do you want to switch, or would you rather keep going on like this? That check-in gives both people permission to change their minds without feeling like they're breaking an agreement. Agree on signals, not just safe words, but switch cues. If you're planning to switch mid-scene, you need clear communication about how that switch is initiated. Maybe it's verbal, like, "I'm ready to switch now." Maybe it's a physical cue. If I hand you the flogger, that's me inviting you to take over. Maybe it's a pause and eye contact. We'll both take a breath, look at each other, and if we're both nodding, we know we're ready to flip. The key is that the switch doesn't happen through assumption or ambiguous signals. There's a clear moment of mutual agreement that says, yes, we're changing roles now. And just like with safe words, make sure these switch cues are actually accessible to both people when they're in an activated or vulnerable state. Do capacity checks. Make sure both partners have the bandwidth to switch. Just because you negotiated switching doesn't mean both people will have the same resources to actually do it when the moment comes. Capacity includes physical energy, like, do you have the stamina to switch from receiving to giving, or are you already tapped out? Emotional resources, like, do you have the emotional bandwidth to hold space for your partner in a different way than you have been? And mental headspace, like, can you shift from the headspace of one role into the headspace of another, or are you too deep in a specific state to make that transition? It's completely okay to realize mid-scene that you don't have capacity to switch even though you thought you would. That's not a failure. That's your nervous system giving you accurate information. Here's an example. You know what? I thought I'd want to switch, but I'm actually really settled into this role and I'd like to stay here. Can we skip the switch tonight? That should always be a safe thing to say. Build in time buffers. Create rituals around switches so the nervous system can transition. Remember Nat and Kellen? What they needed was transition time. Here's what that could look like. When it's time to switch, pause everything. Stop the scene completely. Do something that signals we're stepping out of these roles for a moment. Maybe you sit up, make eye contact, drink some water, take a few deep breaths together, check in verbally about how you're both feeling and whether you're ready to switch. Give the person who's about to take on a new role a moment to settle into that energy. Maybe they need to stretch, shake out their body, or just have a moment of silence to shift gears. Then, when you resume, you're starting fresh in the new roles rather than trying to flip mid flow. These transition rituals might seem like they break the momentum, but they actually create safety that makes the switching sustainable. You're honoring that your nervous system needs time to adjust. Plan for aftercare that honors both roles. Here's something switches often forget: you need aftercare for both roles you played, not just one. If you started the scene bottoming and then switched to topping, you're going to need care that addresses both experiences. You might need physical comfort and grounding from the bottoming part, and emotional processing and decompression from the topping part. Switches need double decompression. That's the chance to be held and to hold, to process both the vulnerability of receiving and the responsibility of giving. Build aftercare time that's long enough for both of you to process both roles. Talk about what came up in each role. Give each other what you need to integrate the full experience. And don't be surprised if aftercare reveals that one role was more challenging or brought up more feelings than you expected. That's important information for next time. All right, we've talked about the challenges and the safety protocols. Now, let's talk about why being a switch is fucking awesome. Because despite the complications, despite the extra negotiation, despite the nervous system gymnastics, switching is a gift. First, let's affirm this clearly. Switching is not less committed or less serious than having a fixed role. There's this weird hierarchy in some kink communities where people who identify strongly as always dominant or always submissive are seen as more authentic or dedicated than switches, as if role fluidity means you're not as invested in the dynamics. That's nonsense. Switching doesn't mean you're lukewarm about power exchange. It means you're interested in the full complexity of what power can do. It means you're not limiting your exploration to one side of the dynamic. If anything, switches often have a deeper understanding of both roles because we've experienced them from the inside. We know what it's like to hold power and to surrender it. We know what bottoms need because we've been there. We know what tops are navigating because we've done it. That range is valuable. It's not a compromise, it's an expansion. Switching creates creative possibilities that fixed roles can't access. When both partners are switches, you get to play with balance in ways that feel dynamic and alive. Maybe you take turns. Maybe you negotiate based on who needs what role in a given day. Maybe you discover that certain activities feel better when you're in a specific role, so you start building scenes that honor those preferences. You get role fluidity, which means your play can evolve based on what you're both feeling rather than being locked into a script. You get balance of power, which can create a sense of equity and mutual exploration that feels different from fixed dynamics. And you get deeper trust because you've both been vulnerable in multiple ways. You know what it's like to be in each other's position, which builds empathy and attunement. For neurodivergent folks especially, switching can be a sensory and emotional regulator. Sometimes control feels grounding. You need the structure, the clarity, the focused energy of directing a scene. Your nervous system needs to be in charge to feel regulated. Other times, surrender feels grounding. You need to let go of decisions, release responsibility, trust someone else to hold the container while you just feel. Your nervous system needs to not be in charge to feel regulated. Both are valid, both are regulating, and having access to both means you have more tools in your toolkit for navigating your nervous system needs. Switching isn't a sign that you can't figure out what you want. It's a sign that you're paying attention to what your body and nervous system actually need in different contexts. So if you're a switch, hear me clearly. Your identity is not confusion. It's complexity. It's range. It's a gift. You don't have to pick a side to be taken seriously. You don't have to commit to one role to prove you're really into power dynamics. You don't have to limit yourself because other people find your fluidity confusing. Your desire for both, for giving and receiving, for control and surrender, for the full spectrum of what intimacy and power can offer, that desire is legitimate, valuable, and worthy of being honored. Let's pause and get reflective for a moment. Think about the roles you've played in intimacy, whether or not you identify as kinky. Think about both sexual roles and broader relational roles. When have you felt most alive giving? What was it about that experience that really lit you up? Was it the control, the responsibility, the pleasure of offering something to another person? When have you felt most alive receiving? What was it about surrendering, letting go, being cared for, or directed that felt good to you? Now, sit with this question. What would it feel like to give yourself permission to hold both identities fully? Not as a compromise, not as an indecision, but as both and rather than either or. Notice if your body lights up at the thought of switching. Does that fluidity feel freeing, exciting, congruent with who you are? Or notice if your body craves steadiness. Maybe you love the idea of role fluidity in theory, but in practice, you're realizing you prefer the clarity of a consistent role. That's valid too. Both are legitimate. There's no right answer here. The only question that matters is, what does your body actually want, as opposed to what you think you should want? If you're a switch, notice what each role gives you. Notice what you need to feel safe transitioning between them. Notice whether there are contexts or partners where switching feels accessible versus contexts where you'd rather stay in one role. And if you're realizing you're not a switch, that you have a clear preference for one role, that's valuable information too. You don't have to be fluid to be evolved or interesting. You just have to be honest about what actually serves your desire. Take a moment with whatever's coming up and notice it without judgment. Your body knows what it needs. As we close this episode, I want you to hear this. Switching isn't about indecision. It's about honoring the full spectrum of what your body and your nervous system desire. With clear consent, planned transitions, and safety nets built into your play, switching can be one of the most creative, liberating dynamics out there. But it requires intention. It requires communication. It requires recognizing that role fluidity doesn't mean boundaries disappear. It means boundaries need to be even more explicit because the terrain is more complex. Your yes, whether you're topping, bottoming, or both, deserves to be heard and honored, not assumed, not pressured, not taken for granted because of your identity label. If you're a switch, you get to negotiate each role separately. You get to change your mind. You get to need transition time. You get to ask for what you need to make role shifts feel safe and sustainable. And if you're partnering with the switch, your job is to never assume, to negotiate explicitly, to build in check-ins, to respect that just because someone has access to both roles doesn't mean they're always available for both. If this episode spoke to you, whether you're a switch yourself or you're learning how to support the switches in your life, subscribe to Untamed Ember wherever you get your podcasts. We're doing this work together, one conversation at a time. And join my newsletter at untamedember.kit.com for deep dives into the nuanced, messy, beautiful terrain of sexuality, power, and embodiment. Until next time, this is Dr. Misty with Untamed Ember, reminding you that your complexity isn't confusion, it's power. And you deserve relationships and play that honor every version of who you are. See you next episode.